Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Garrett Steele never wanted a fight. For 15 years, his home was his sanctuary until the HOA arrived. At first, they were just a nuisance. Then came the threats, the lies, the lawsuits, and at the center of it all, Karen Bennett, a ruthless HOA president who didn't know one thing: Garrett never backs down. For 15 years, Garrett Steele had lived a quiet, peaceful life in his suburban home. He had bought the property long before the neighborhood expanded, back when it was just a small collection of houses surrounded by open land. Over the years, he had built his home into a sanctuary, a place where his children could play freely, where his wife could enjoy their garden, and where he could relax after long work days. The backyard was spacious, with a modest above-ground pool and a playground for the kids. But as time passed, everything changed. The once small neighborhood grew into a densely packed suburban community. More and more houses were built, and with them came an increasing number of new residents with new rules. It wasn't long before an HOA, Homeowners Association, was formed, promising to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic and order. Garrett, however, had no interest in joining. He had purchased his land long before the HOA existed, and he had no obligation to abide by their rules. Along with a few other longtime residents, he refused membership, preferring to live by his own terms. At first, the HOA made several attempts to pressure him into joining. Letters arrived in his mailbox suggesting he contribute to the community fund or adhere to their regulations. HOA representatives even visited his home, insisting that he would benefit from membership, but Garrett stood firm. "I bought my property before the HOA was even a thought," he told them. "I don't need anyone telling me how to manage it." Eventually, the HOA seemed to give up, or so he thought. For years, they left him alone, focusing their energy on enforcing rules on their own members. Garrett went about his life, believing that his decision had been respected. Then came Karen Bennett. She was elected HOA president just a few months ago, and almost immediately, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Karen was ruthless, power-hungry, and obsessed with control. Under her leadership, the HOA became even stricter, fines increased, regulations became more ridiculous, and the HOA took a no-tolerance approach to anyone who resisted their authority. Garrett heard rumors that Karen had a personal vendetta against independent homeowners like him, but he paid little attention. As far as he was concerned, he was untouchable. His property wasn't part of the HOA, and no rule they passed had any effect on him. But he was about to learn that Karen wasn't the type to let something go. The conflict would begin with a road that wasn't even supposed to exist. Garrett had always valued being a good neighbor. His property, a spacious lot with a backyard that extended toward a wooded area, had once been a simple, quiet retreat. Years ago, before the HOA ever existed, he had allowed a few local families to walk across a small pathway at the back of his lot to reach the nearby lake. It was a harmless shortcut, and it saved them a few extra minutes of walking around the block. The arrangement worked well, people were respectful, and Garrett had no reason to complain. But as the neighborhood grew, so did the number of people using the path. What had once been an occasional footpath for neighbors turned into something else entirely. At first, it was just a few bicycles cutting through. Then, as more houses were built, delivery drivers started using his property as a shortcut to reach homes on the other side. And then it escalated even further. People began driving through his yard in their cars, some slowly, others as if they were on a public road. Garrett watched in disbelief as SUVs, sedans, and even pickup trucks casually cut through his land, flattening his grass and leaving deep tire marks in the dirt. At first, he tried the polite approach. He spoke to a few drivers directly, explaining that this was private property and asking them to stop. Most of them brushed him off, some even laughing as they drove away. Then one morning, Garrett watched as a red sports car came speeding through his backyard, kicking up dust and gravel. His youngest son, Ethan, only 6 years old, had been playing near the swing set, completely unaware of the danger. The car barely missed him by a few feet before speeding off. That was it. Enough was enough. That same afternoon, Garrett installed a large sign at the entrance to the makeshift road. It read in bold capital letters, "Private property, no trespassing, no vehicle access." He placed another one on the other side of his yard, ensuring that no one could claim they hadn't seen it. He even put up a temporary rope barrier, stretching it across the path to make it clear that the shortcut was no longer accessible. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The traffic stopped. His backyard was quiet again. But then the backlash began. First, it was the passive-aggressive complaints from neighbors. One morning, he found a note stuck to his mailbox. "Why are you being so selfish? This path has been used for years." Then, the arguments started. A man in a business suit knocked on his door, demanding that Garrett remove the signs because his commute had now become 10 minutes longer. Another neighbor accused him of ruining the sense of community. But the worst part came 2 days later. Garrett woke up to find that his signs had been torn down and the rope barrier had been cut clean through. Whoever had done it wanted to send a message. This wasn't over. That evening, as Garrett stood in his backyard surveying the deep tire marks that had reappeared in the dirt, his wife Lauren stepped beside him. "This isn't going to stop, is it?" she said, arms crossed. Garrett exhaled, his jaw tightening. "No," he admitted. "Not unless I make sure of it." That's when he decided he was going to build a fence. Not just a small one, a real solid barrier that would make it clear once and for all that his land was off limits. He reached for his phone and called a fencing contractor. "How soon can you start?" Garrett wasted no time. Within a few days, he had met with a contractor, chosen the materials, and set a date for construction. He opted for a sturdy 6-foot wooden fence, reinforced with concrete posts to ensure no one could knock it down easily. It would enclose the entire perimeter of his backyard once and for all, putting an end to the unauthorized traffic through his land. The morning the construction began, the first signs of trouble appeared. As the workers unloaded supplies and prepared to dig the first post holes, several cars pulled up near Garrett's property. The drivers, clearly irritated, rolled down their windows and began shouting at the workers. "You can't block this off. People need to get through here," yelled an older man in a pickup truck. A woman in a silver sedan honked her horn. "This is ridiculous. What gives you the right?" Garrett, standing nearby, took a deep breath and walked toward the growing crowd. "This is my property," he said firmly. "I've asked nicely, I've put up signs, and you all ignored them. So now I'm building a fence." "Selfish bastard," the man muttered before slamming his door shut and driving off, cutting across the grass one last time as an act of defiance. Despite the initial commotion, the construction continued. Garrett kept an eye on things while the crew worked quickly, installing post after post, securing the foundation of the fence. By the end of the second day, the structure was already taking shape. That's when Karen showed up. She arrived in a sleek black SUV, stepping out with an air of authority, her perfectly ironed blouse crisp under the morning sun. She walked right up to Garrett's property as if she owned it. "You must be Garrett Steele," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Garrett crossed his arms. "And you must be Karen." "I see you've been busy," she said, gesturing to the half-built fence. "Unfortunately, this is a violation of HOA regulations, and I'm here to inform you that you're being fined." Garrett chuckled. "I'm not part of your HOA, Karen. Your rules don't apply to me." Karen's expression didn't change. She reached into her leather folder and pulled out an official-looking document. "This is a formal notice of violation," she said, holding it up. "You are being fined $10,000 for unauthorized construction and obstruction of an established community pathway." Garrett narrowed his eyes. "Established by who?" "This is my land." "Always has been." Karen's smile was cold. "This shortcut has been in use for years. It is considered a community access route under HOA policy." Garrett let out a sharp breath. "Again, I'm not part of your HOA." Karen ignored his response and continued. "You have 7 days to remove the fence and restore access to the pathway, or we will escalate legal action." Garrett didn't flinch. "Take me to court then. I have the deed to my land, and there's no easement, no right of way." "You don't have a case." Karen tilted her head, studying him. Then her smile widened, a knowing, almost sinister smirk. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said smoothly. "Enjoy your week, Mr. Steele. It's going to be a rough one." With that, she turned and walked back to her SUV, leaving Garrett standing in his yard, clutching the so-called violation notice in his hand. His instincts told him that this wasn't just an empty threat. Karen was planning something. Garrett didn't waste a second. As soon as Karen drove away, he called his lawyer, Daniel Carter, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who had dealt with HOA overreach cases before. She hit me with a $10,000 fine and claims I'm blocking a community access route, Garrett explained. I don't even belong to the HOA. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. Classic power move. She's banking on intimidation. Send me a copy of your deed, the property survey, and any documents you have about the HOA. Garrett quickly scanned and emailed everything. Within an hour, Daniel called back. Good news, you're in the clear, he said. Your deed has no mention of an easement, and the HOA has zero legal standing over your property. The shortcut was never officially designated as a right-of-way. Great, Garrett said. So I can just ignore them? Daniel hesitated. Not quite. Karen's type doesn't back down easily. Expect retaliation. They'll send inspectors, try to catch you on technicalities, maybe even involve the city. I'd recommend installing security cameras immediately. That night, Garrett went to work. He bought 4 high-definition security cameras and mounted them at key points around his property, covering the fence line, the backyard, and the entrances. He made sure they recorded everything and uploaded footage to cloud storage. The next morning, as expected, the HOA struck again. A group of 3 board members, accompanied by an attorney in a cheap suit, arrived at his front gate. Garrett walked out, his arms crossed. We need to inspect the property, the lead representative, a bald man named Richard, announced. To document violations, Garrett smirked. Not happening. The attorney adjusted his tie. Refusing an inspection will be taken as admission of guilt. Garrett pulled out his phone and called Daniel on speaker. Hey Daniel, I've got some HOA folks here demanding to inspect my land. Do I have to let them in? Daniel's voice came through loud and clear. Absolutely not. If they try to enter without a court order, they're trespassing. Garrett smiled. You heard the man. Now get off my property. Richard's face turned red. The attorney scribbled something in his notepad. Then, without another word, they turned and left. But they weren't done. A few hours later, a police officer showed up. Garrett met him at the front door. Afternoon, officer. What's the issue? The cop, looking slightly uncomfortable, held up a formal complaint from the HOA. They're claiming you stole part of their land and built an unauthorized structure on it. They've requested an official investigation. Garrett let out a laugh. They're full of it. I have my deed and property survey right here. The officer glanced at the documents, nodded, and sighed. Yeah, this checks out. Look, I had to follow up, but this is a civil matter, not a criminal one. They'll need a court order to do anything. Garrett shook his hand. Thanks for doing your job. As the officer left, Garrett knew one thing for sure. Karen wasn't giving up, and neither was he. For a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. Garrett knew Karen wasn't the type to give up easily, but for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had realized she couldn't win. That illusion was shattered 3 nights later. It was close to midnight when Garrett's security cameras sent an alert to his phone. Someone was near the fence line. Half asleep, he pulled up the feed and felt his stomach drop. A man in a hoodie was hacking at his brand new fence with a hatchet. Garrett sprang out of bed, grabbed his phone, and called the police immediately. He stormed outside, flipping on the powerful floodlights, bathing the yard in white light. Hey, he shouted, get the hell off my property. The intruder froze, then turned and bolted, but not before Garrett's cameras captured his face. The police arrived within minutes. By then, Garrett had already pulled the footage and showed it to the officers. One of them frowned. We know this guy. He's a local. No priors. But this is definitely criminal damage. Arrest him, Garrett said firmly. They found the man an hour later, still in the neighborhood. The officers cuffed him and questioned him on the spot. At first, he claimed ignorance, but when pressed, he let something slip. The HOA told me the fence was illegally built, he muttered. They said it was just a matter of time before it got taken down anyway. Garrett gritted his teeth. So this was Karen's game. She wasn't attacking directly. She was manipulating others to do her dirty work. The man was charged with trespassing and destruction of property. When word of his arrest spread, some of Garrett's more reasonable neighbors started to question the HOA's motives. But Karen doubled down. Over the next few days, Garrett began noticing strange things. His garbage cans were knocked over every morning. A neighbor confronted him, furious over a fake letter supposedly written by him criticizing the community. His mailbox was stuffed with anonymous hate mail calling him a selfish bastard and the worst neighbor in the HOA. which was ironic since he wasn't even in the HOA. Then came the direct confrontations. One evening, as Garrett was working in his yard, a middle-aged man with a crowbar approached his fence. "Move," the man ordered. "This road's been here for years, and no damn fence is going to change that." Garrett stayed calm, but his hand hovered over his phone, ready to call 911. "This isn't a road. It's my land." The man raised the crowbar like he was about to start swinging. "Then I'll make it a road again." That was his mistake. Garrett took a step forward. "You touch that fence, and I swear to God." Blue and red flashing lights suddenly flooded the street. Someone, probably a concerned neighbor, had already called the police. The officers jumped out, weapons drawn. "Drop the crowbar. Hands in the air." The man immediately complied, stammering about how he was just fixing a problem. He was arrested on the spot. Garrett watched in grim satisfaction. Karen was losing control, and she didn't even know it yet. Garrett knew that Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate him. She was laying the groundwork for something bigger. The vandalism, the harassment, the manipulated neighbors. It was all a setup, an attempt to paint him as the real problem in the community. And then it happened. One afternoon, Garrett checked his mailbox and found 2 envelopes. One was from the HOA, the other from the county courthouse. He opened the HOA letter first. "Mr. Steele, due to the obstruction of a community access road and the damage caused to neighborhood cohesion, you are hereby ordered to compensate the HOA in the amount of $60,000. You must also remove all unauthorized structures on your property within 7 days, or legal action will be taken." Garrett clenched his teeth. 60 grand. They were actually demanding he pay them for blocking off his own land. Then, with a sinking feeling, he opened the court summons. Inside was a judge's order demanding that Garrett cease all construction on his property immediately. According to the HOA's complaint, his fence was an illegal obstruction, and his recent renovations, including his planned in-ground pool, violated community regulations. His heart pounded with anger. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. Karen had gone straight to the courts, fabricated evidence, and managed to get a temporary injunction against him. She was playing dirty. But Garrett was ready. He called Daniel Carter, his attorney, and explained everything. Daniel was furious. They got a judge to sign an injunction based on what? Lies, Garrett said. They're claiming I'm blocking an established access road and that I'm violating HOA rules. Daniel snorted. They don't have jurisdiction over you, and that access road has never been legally recognized. What do we do? Garrett asked. We file a counter lawsuit today. The very next morning, as Garrett was finalizing his legal filings, Karen arrived with reinforcements. She wasn't alone this time. Standing beside her were 2 large men in security uniforms, along with an HOA lawyer in an expensive suit. Garrett, already recording audio on his phone, stepped out onto his porch. Karen didn't bother with pleasantries. Mr. Steele, I assume you've received our notice. Garrett folded his arms. I did. And I assume you know you're full of shit? Karen's expression remained icy. You have until the end of the week to comply, or we'll begin removing your fence for you. One of the security goons stepped forward, trying to look intimidating. Garrett didn't even flinch. You set foot on my land, and I promise you, you'll be in handcuffs before you take your next breath. Karen laughed. Oh, Garrett, that attitude is exactly why you're about to lose everything. She took a slow step forward, lowering her voice. Drop the counter lawsuit, take down the fence, and pay the fine, she whispered, or this gets worse. Garrett shook his head. Not happening. Karen's smile vanished. Fine, she snapped. Then let's make this painful. Before Garrett could react, she suddenly grabbed his arm. The moment her fingers latched onto his wrist, she let out a piercing scream. Help! Help! He's attacking me! The 2 security guards tackled Garrett, slamming him to the ground. Let go of me! Garrett shouted, struggling, but they held him down, one of them twisting his arm behind his back. Karen collapsed onto the grass, fake tears streaming down her face. I told you he was violent, she wailed. Garrett gritted his teeth in pain, but through the chaos, he saw something Karen didn't. His workers had been watching, and one of them had recorded everything. A loud siren filled the air. Someone, probably one of his employees, had called the police. Within moments, 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop and officers jumped out, weapons drawn. Karen immediately sprang to her feet and ran toward them. "Officers, arrest him! He assaulted me!" Actually, one of the construction workers interrupted, holding up his phone. "I think you'll want to see this first." The officers reviewed the footage, watching Karen fake the attack, watching her security team assault Garrett. One of the cops looked at her and raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, would you like to explain this?" Karen turned pale. That's not enough," the officer said. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Karen's mouth fell open. "Wait, you're arresting me? He attacked me. I'm the victim." One of the officers gestured to the phone. "The footage says otherwise." Click, click. Karen was cuffed, her security guards also arrested, and Garrett. The cops helped him to his feet. "Do you want to press charges?" one of them asked. Garrett cracked his knuckles. "Oh, you better believe it." The next morning, Daniel filed an emergency motion submitting the video footage as evidence of Karen's false accusations and harassment. The judge immediately lifted the injunction, allowing Garrett to resume work on his property. But more importantly, the HOA's case completely fell apart. Karen had just sunk her own ship, and Garrett was about to finish the job. The day of the final court showdown had arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Residents of the neighborhood, HOA members, and even some reporters had come to watch the spectacle unfold. Karen sat at the defendant's table, looking rigid and pale, her once confident smirk nowhere to be seen. Her lawyer sat beside her, shuffling through stacks of documents that were practically useless now. On the other side, Garrett and his attorney, Daniel Carter, were completely calm and prepared. The judge, a grizzled man with decades on the bench, took his seat. "Let's get to it," he said. The HOA's lawyer was the first to speak, launching into a long-winded argument about how Garrett had illegally obstructed a long-established pathway and how his refusal to comply had damaged the community. Garrett barely listened. He was waiting for his turn to strike. When Daniel stood, he wasted no time tearing apart their case. "Your Honor," Daniel began, placing a stack of documents on the table. "This case is built on nothing but fabricated claims and fraudulent documents." He walked toward the judge, holding up Garrett's original property deed. This document, which predates the HOA itself, clearly shows that Mr. Steele's property has never had a designated public access route. The so-called community pathway was nothing more than neighbors cutting across his yard without permission. The HOA's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Daniel continued. "And yet, my client was fined, harassed, and threatened for simply exercising his right to private property. But it doesn't stop there." He picked up a different stack of papers. "These are documents submitted by the HOA, claiming that Garrett's property was part of their jurisdiction. However, we have reason to believe these documents were altered in an attempt to exert illegal control over his land." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Daniel turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, we are formally requesting that this case be dismissed with extreme prejudice and that the individuals responsible for these fraudulent claims be held accountable." The judge nodded. "That's a serious accusation. What proof do you have?" Daniel smiled and turned to the real knockout punch, the video evidence. With the judge's approval, he played the footage of Karen faking the attack on Garrett. The room went silent. The judge's eyes narrowed. Karen turned red. Her lawyer slumped in his seat, and the HOA board members who had supported her looked horrified. When the video ended, the judge slowly turned to Karen. "Well," he said, his voice heavy with disapproval, "would you like to explain why you falsely accused Mr. Steele of assault?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. She was trapped. The judge wasn't done. "Not only did you orchestrate a false police report, but you knowingly submitted fraudulent documents to this court. That is perjury, and that is a criminal offense." Karen froze. Daniel delivered the final blow. "Your Honor, in light of all this, my client is filing a counterclaim against the HOA for harassment, emotional distress, and damages totaling $150,000. We are also requesting that Karen Bennett be investigated for fraud and that the HOA be audited to determine if this kind of abuse has happened before." The judge nodded gravely. "That request is granted." Karen gasped. The HOA board members flinched. The ruling came swiftly. Garrett's fence was 100% legal. The HOA had no authority over his property. The $60,000 fine was dismissed. Karen was removed as HOA president effective immediately. The HOA was ordered to pay Garrett $150,000 in damages. And then came the biggest moment of all. Mrs. Bennett, the judge said, staring directly at Karen, given the evidence of fraud and false accusations, I am recommending that the district attorney pursue criminal charges against you. Karen visibly swallowed. The court is adjourned. Bang! The gavel struck, and just like that, it was over, or rather, Karen was over. The dust had finally settled. Garrett had won. Karen was removed from the HOA. The fraud investigation was underway, and the $150,000 settlement had already begun processing. With the HOA publicly humiliated and legally crippled, they had no choice but to back off for good. The best part? The neighborhood turned against them. Once the truth came out, former HOA supporters realized they had been manipulated. Some members resigned in embarrassment. Others apologized to Garrett, admitting they had believed Karen's lies. Even some of the most aggressive neighbors distanced themselves from the HOA altogether. With the battle over, Garrett focused on what mattered: his home, his family, and his long-awaited backyard project. Just a few weeks later, his new in-ground pool was finally finished. Surrounded by a beautiful patio and a brand-new outdoor kitchen, it was exactly what he had dreamed of. To celebrate, Garrett threw a massive pool party, inviting only the neighbors who had stood by him. The laughter of children filled the air, the grill sizzled with steaks, and for the first time in months, Garrett felt completely at peace. As he stood on his deck, drink in hand, he took one last glance toward the former HOA president's house. Karen had moved out. Her once pristine lawn was overgrown, the HOA president plaque was gone, and the power she once held had vanished. Garrett smiled. It wasn't just his victory, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been bullied by people like her. And as he jumped into his brand new pool, he knew one thing for certain. This was his land, his home, his rules, and no one was ever going to take that away from him again.